Yeah, I think so. The usual. Thank you, Tula. No matter how much I adjust it, in the end, you have to. Yeah. A bunch of us are going to go to the Golden Walk. Rame Junje Mala Lon Jing Sada Lam Ji Yande Ranzo Noranje Jange Goba Nyorando Joy Sanje Jadon Zaje Janam Lai Janjo Bardo Dane Jamzo Dange Jenzo Jebe Zanam Jerola Benje Zanje Roma Joy Sanje Judon Zai Lai Janjo Bardo Dane Jamzo Jadage Jenzo Jebe Zanam Rola Benjer Zanje Romba Joy Zanje Judon Zanje Janam Lai Janjo Bardo Dane Jamzo Jimbe Zanam Jerola Benjer Zanje Romba Jo Simjen Damje Dewat Devi Judan Dembara Joje Dungal Don Dungal Je Jolon Dawara Joje Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Dom Medrawa Joj Nyering Jala Nilon Do Donyon Jambola Neba Joje Simjen Damje Dewa Don Devi Judan Dembara Joje Dungal Don Dungal Je Jolon Dawara Joj Dungal Mebe Dawa Damba Don Medawara Joje Nyering Jala Nilon Do Donyom Jambola Neba Joje Samjen Damje Dewa Don Devi Judan Dambara Dungal Don Dungal Je Jolon Dawara Joje Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Don Medawara Joj Nyering Jala Nilon Do Tonyam Jambola Neba Joje Dada Semjen Tamje Lo Chuso Dowara Jinje Lamdo So Jelamdo Dowara Jinje Lamdo Lamdromba Sawara Jinje Lamdo So Dromba Yeshe So Jawara Jinje Lamdo So Dada Semjen Tamje Lo Chuso Do Lamdo So Jalamdo Dowara Jinja Lamdo So Lamdromba Sawara Jinja Lamdo So Dromba Yeshe So Jawara Jinja Lamdo So Dada Zenjan Tamje Lo Juzo Dowara Jinja Lamdo So Jelando Dowara Jinja Lamdo So Lam Dromba Sawara Jinja Lamdo Yeshe So Jawara Jinja Lamdo So Mo Jin Yo Jin No Jan Zambam Ge Zara Dombo La Yan Zen Joge Ngodo Nyembe Ma Jon She Zon Don Goron Do Gondro Mon Bu Gora Je Je Jes Ren Je Jen Je La Je Je Zo Zo Ne Jon De Ro Jem Bo La Do Da La Wong Je Gora Ge Ba Je Zo Jo Don Do Mong On Do Zo Om Ben Zra Mudra samaya sarva siddha are mahare nisaranzare Siddharam rim zan zan gora gandran zoje jedat mame bona la lu la goye jinja la nga la sunge jinja la duan jen jen la wan jen gor war jen la jen lam jen la lang zhong bar jen la goi jen dom la om Saragorabam Devadagene Gaya Ambegenza Om Vaga Ab Genza Atsinda Abegenza Om Sarva Begenza. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Some of you probably know a tremendous amount about our topic or topics for the weekend, and some of you may be quite new. Oddly, that won't affect what I have to do, because my particular job in this place is to kind of summarize things that have been taught by Rinpoche and Lama Trotop, and so that if you've missed, for example, Lama Trotop's continuing series on the stages of the path, or Rinpoche's teachings on the songs of Terchen Barway Dorje, many of which deal with this topic, I can at least give you enough of a background that you can attend other sessions and follow what's going on. The other thing, of course, is to give you background information that will help enrich your practice, both your personal daily practice, whatever it is, and our monthly and yearly practices. Since the basis for our monthly soaps and our yearly practice intensives is the generation stage and to some extent the completion stage, it's helpful to have a background information. Because when you understand how these things fit together, then it's easier to relate to the specifics of each practice. Now, the specifics obviously vary. When we need to get specific here, I'll probably be using the Guru Rinpoche practice that we do on the 10th day. Because of all of the practices we do, it's probably the one with which people are the most familiar. Now, I've done something that I told myself I would never do, which is I've got bifocals. And some of you will know, yes. Yeah. But anyway, that was all insurance would allow, and they're even objecting to that now. But, so, I'll be doing this a lot. The first thing we need to do, and I will, when I'm certain of my source for various statements, I will give you sources so you can, if a particular point interests you, you can pursue it in your own study and reading. The first thing to do is to define a generation and completion. Now, the generation stage, which is Kirim or Chirim in Tibetan, is the Tibetan translation of one of two Sanskrit terms. And clever, scholarly people, not like me, but clever scholars, are constantly trying to one-up one another about which is correct. So every 5 years a paper will come out saying it's not Utpatti Krama, it's Nispana Krama. And then the next scholar will come out with it. So I'll leave that to them. So it was either Utpatti Krama or Nispana Krama. Krama is stage, or stages. In either case, what it refers to is birth. Giving birth and being born. And that's why some of us translate it as a generation, a stage. The definition of a generation stage, samadhi or meditation, is the contemplation of an imaginary devakaya. Deva is deity and kaya is body. So Jonglo Drutai, in his Treasury of Knowledge, that's my first citation, defines, and I think he goes with Nispana Krama, but I'm not sure. In fact, he might say Nishpana, I can't remember. Anyway, it's in, you'll be able to find it in the book. He defines the generation stage as the contemplation of an imaginary deity body. Now, why this is connected with birth, we'll see in a minute. In contrast to that, the completion stage, and some people translate it as perfection. It's that Tibetan word dzog, which can mean finished, completed, perfect, full of, and so on, all sorts of things. So dzogrim, completion or perfection stage, is defined as the contemplation of an actual devakaya or deity body. Now, Jonglo Drutai makes this point at the beginning of his presentation of these two stages in the Treasury of Knowledge, because he wants to relieve us of a very common misconception. And this misconception is not entirely a misconception, which is why it's so very common. This misconception is that the generation stage corresponds to birth, as its name would indicate, and the completion stage corresponds to death. And this misconception comes from a kind of, if I may use the term, Disneyfication of the Vajrayana that has happened historically. Not gentrification, it's more like reducing it to something that is palatable and can be presented to the public. In other words, boulderizing it, censoring it, distorting it, possibly destroying it. Yeah. Because that way, if you don't really want to teach people how to practice Vajrayana, what you tell them is that when you imagine the deity, that's the generation stage. And then when you dissolve the deity into emptiness, that's the completion stage. And that is the public version of what these are. So Jonglo Drutai's first point is, how do I put this politely? That's wrong. That's not what they are. If that was all they were, why would we need to do 3-year retreats? Why would we need to do yearly practice intensives? I mean, if that was all this was, that be very easy, right? You could just do it. You could have tea. You could sit and have polite tea parties and then, oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting snarky. I'll stop. Well, I won't, but I'll stop for a moment. So now when I say it's not absolutely wrong, it's not absolutely wrong because there is an aspect, and we'll get into that tomorrow morning, of the completion stage that does very much correspond to death. But strictly speaking, that moment in a generation stage sadhana practice where you dissolve the visualization either gradually or all at once into emptiness is still a practice of the generation stage, not the completion stage. Because the generation stage does correspond to birth, but it corresponds to all the events of your life, starting with the beginning and all the way up to the end. And we'll look in a few minutes at why. So I think it's better to stick with Jungul Dutai's definition rather than the more common oversimplification, which is that the generation stage is the contemplation of an imaginary devakaya, and the completion stage is the contemplation of an actual or truly existent devakaya. Now, one of the other reasons Jungul Dutai says that he needs to make this clear at the beginning is that if we don't understand that, then we tend to imagine, because we have to imagine something because we're curious, that the completion stage is very, very zen-y, as Sutra Rinpoche would put it. Now, I have nothing against Zen, and I'm sure His Eminence Sutra Rinpoche has nothing against Zen. But the completion stage in Vajrayana is not the same thing. And if you dispute that, please read Nupchen Sanjay Yeshe's Samten Migdran, Light on Meditation, written in the 9th century. Still available now, very hard to read because Tibetan has changed. But it's very good because it's a comparative study of Indian gradualist Mahayana, Chan, as it was taught and very much respected in the 9th century in Tibet, Mahayoga, Vajrayana, and Dzogchen. And he compares these four systems, showing how they are all valid Mahayana systems which lead to awakening, but how they're very different. Okay. So now we need to look at the purpose of these two stages. Why do we need two stages? If the completion stage is the contemplation of an actual deity body, then what point is there in contemplating an imaginary deity body? The generation stage, according to the Vajrayana teachings themselves, and again, I'm not talking about the public version, but like what Lama Trotop's been teaching, what Rinpoche teaches, the generation stage is a preliminary. When we, and His Holiness, the 17th Karmapa, talked about this recently in some Flushing or somewhere. We have this idea that Vajrayana practice is a bunch of people sitting around chanting, playing musical instruments, and moving their malas at unlikely speeds, considering the length of the mantras. I mean, I've seen people, hey, there I go. Okay, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go there. And his point was, there's a lot more to it than that. But at the same time, most of us cannot practice the completion stage without being trained in the generation stage. And in fact, we cannot practice the generation stage or the completion stage without the one indispensable preliminary. Other preliminaries are excellent, but there is one that is absolutely indispensable, and that is training in bodhicitta. The training in the motivation of relative bodhicitta, which has two aspects. The aspect that's focused on perfect awakening, and the aspect that's focused on benefiting all beings, is essential. When we talk about uniting wisdom and means, or wisdom and compassion, the fundamental way that we do that in reality, on a day-to-day basis, is by combining our wish to liberate all beings, including ourselves, but we're just one among trillions, all beings from suffering, which is compassion, and our recognition that the only way to do that is to achieve perfect Buddhahood. And these things sound separate, but eventually they have to become the same thing. The wisdom aspect, the smart aspect, is the recognition that the only ultimate answer to suffering is to achieve Buddhahood. But the motivation, the kindness, the love, the compassion of it, is the desire to free all beings from suffering. And these two things must be cultivated until they become one thing. That is the unification of wisdom and compassion. We don't need to be highfalutin and talk about the symbology of the iconography and so on yet. The true unification is when that wisdom, that intelligent understanding, and that compassion, that commitment to the well-being of others become indistinguishable from one another. Now, the reason I mention this is not only because it is the absolutely necessary preliminary for any other Mahayana practice, but because the generation stage is really an extension of that. Before we get into the details of the generation stage, its view and its meditation, we need to talk about essentially what it is. I need to make sure you have the big picture. And the generation stage is an exercise in love. It is training your mind to eradicate all rejection of the environment, of yourself, and of others, and to allow your mind to love the world. Not the world in the sense of the foolish things we do, but the true reality of things. In teaching this point, Khenchen Trungpa Rinpoche, once teaching the Guru Rinpoche practice, quoted from a poem by the 6th Dalai Lama. Now, the 6th Dalai Lama wrote a great deal of erotic poetry, but some of his poems were only quasi-erotic. In other words, they made references to romantic love in order to make an entirely different point. And this is one of them. It's a couplet, and it simply says, "No matter how hard I try, I cannot clearly imagine my Guru above my head. No matter how hard I try, I cannot get the image of my beloved out of my mind." Now, the point of this poem is not you should love your lover more than your Guru. The point is the nature of the generation stage is, frankly, being in love with the deity. Not romantically. Something more deep, something deeper, more cutting more basic than that. And the idea is that your devotion to the deity is so strong that it eventually becomes effortless to see everyone and everything as the deity. Now, there is an argument in Mahayoga philosophy, which if you want to read in full, is in the book Establishing Appearances as Divine. But the argument simply, very simply put, I won't be doing it justice, is if it is true that nothing we experience is outside our mind in the sense that if we experience it, it is happening within our mind, and therefore that everything is colored by our mind. It is our mind that really determines how we see things and especially how we feel about them. If that is true, and if it is also true that the nature of any and every mind is Dharmakaya, and these are two things that we are supposed to believe or accept, then it follows that all appearances are divine. That's the argument. It's basically a syllogism. But knowing that does not do anything. What actually makes the difference is your devotion to the deity, inseparable from your guru, and ultimately inseparable from all beings. So to quote one of our liturgies, the Guru Rinpoche one, one of the things that the shrine master, or shrine attendant, really it's shrine master, says before presenting the feast is everything is the deity. Everything is the nature of the deity. So the idea is that you are so in love with Guru Rinpoche, it could be any deity, I'm going to use him as an example because of where we are, that you see him everywhere. All right. The purpose of the generation stage is to change our habits. We have a habit of seeing ourselves, others, and the world as bad, as limited. And we justify this habit by referring to history, our own history, and that of the world. I can say it's a bad world because this is happening there and this is happening here. I'm a bad person because I was angry at my mother when I was a child and I'm not good at relationships and I can be a bully. Now, those are both true statements. But the conclusion that I draw from them, that the world is bad or that I'm bad, these are mistaken conclusions. So the generation stage is very much connected with reviewing our story, the story that we tell ourselves, and learning to see it differently. Therefore, every aspect of the generation stage corresponds to something. Now, this being Vajrayana Buddhism, of course, it's not just one thing, it's four things. The basis of purification, that's one. That which is to be purified, that's two. And some people fail to distinguish between those two, which is Jitsun Taranata wrote, turns this whole thing into nonsense. So the ground of purification, that which is to be purified, that which purifies it, and the result of purification. The ground of purification is easy to refer to, but we have to understand that any reference we make is basically a cop-out. We're using jargon because we don't really know what it is. If anyone here in this room, including me, actually knew what the ground was, they could fly up through the ceiling right now. I can't do that. If any of you can do that, I'd like to see it, because I've never seen that. But you don't have to if you're shy. But I will tell you the truth. I cannot do that. Therefore, I know that I have not realized the ground. That's very simple. So we call the ground Buddha nature. Now, we've all seen it. We've all felt it. But not completely, and that's the difference. As His Eminence Rinpoche once said, it's very easy to explain Buddha nature partially. It is feeling touched. He said, you have this wonderful expression in English, I felt touched. What you did touched me. He said, that is the feeling of Buddha nature. But there's a big difference between hearing that, knowing that, it's worthwhile knowing, that's why I mention it, repeat it, and being able to fly through the ceiling. So the ground of purification is Buddha nature, the Dharmakaya, the clear light, luminosity, the great perfection, Mahamudra, the great middle state, whatever you want to call it. We don't know what any of these words mean, let's be honest. We use them, but we don't really, well, I don't know. I can't say what you know or what you don't know. What is to be purified is our habit. And there are several ways of looking at it. One way is to say the habit of seeing yourself as a self and seeing everything that is not yourself as other. But you might ask, if I say that, well, you've just proven the validity of that perception by using the term seeing yourself as a self and seeing that which is other as other. Actually, I haven't. All I've proven is that I am talking in the context of delusion. It would be like if we all took some very, very controllable hallucinogenic that would give us all the same hallucinations, and we all saw a green dragon over there. And I would say, we are all hallucinating. By seeing that green dragon as a green dragon, we are hallucinating. And depending upon what else the drug did to us, whether it befuddled us or merely caused us to see things that weren't there, we might or might not agree on that. So, to see yourself as a self is delusion. And to see other as other is also delusion. But why? Because it seems really, really true. Each of us has or is a body and a mind. And this afternoon or tomorrow morning or sometime we'll get into the issue of speech, but let's just say a body-mind for now. And that's true, reasonably true. We can't talk about what's really true for the same reason we can't talk about the ground, but that's reliable to say you are a body-mind. That's okay. But to say you're a self is not, for a very simple reason. We have the concept of self because of perspective. It's useful. It's fundamentally a grammatical device, a linguistic concept. Now, non-linguistic species, like animals, have a subtle concept of self because of their perspective, because they inhabit a certain body mind and everything else is around it. But if I were a self, then everyone in this room, when referring to me, would say me. But you don't. When you're talking to me, you call me you. When you're talking about me, you call me him. If Davis were a self, then each and every one of us, when we thought of Davis, would think I or me. But we don't. We're talking to Davis, we say you. Talking about him, we say him. That's all it takes to disprove selfhood. The whole concept of self is an attempt to unjustifiably reify an entirely subjective perspective. But knowing that does nothing. Our self-fixation, our selfishness have not diminished in the last 2 minutes of discussing this, because there is a strong habit of it. And oddly, this habit is defended by a sense of wrongness, sense of how bad we are. In extreme cases, how we don't even deserve to exist, don't deserve to live. Now you would think, common sense would make you think, but surely a sense of wrongness, a sense of I'm bad, would weaken the sense of self, but it doesn't. In a teaching on the, was he teaching on the Bardor or was he teaching on the generation stage? Well, anyway, he was talking about the generation stage, but I don't remember the context. It was in Vancouver. Kenshin Trungpa Rinpoche once said, when I was interpreting for him, that although you would think that imagining yourself as a deity would strengthen your ego, reinforce your self-fixation, it actually does the opposite. Because the bulwarks of your ego, your self-fixation, are not the Buddha nature with which you are identifying when you imagine yourself as a deity, but all the things you don't like about yourself. And he said, if you think that you're going to purify all those things you don't like about yourself by fixating on them, you won't. You just empower them. You just give yourself to their power. You purify them by focusing on your Buddha nature. And by extension, because we cannot fly through the ceiling, because we've not realized the ground, we need to imagine it. So another way to look at the generation stage is it's using imagination to view a reality that we cannot yet see directly. And I'll give you a practical example of this. I do not have great night vision. I'm fine to drive, I'm fine to do things, but if I'm in an unfamiliar environment, traveling, staying in a hotel room and so on, and I get up to go to the bathroom, I may have to just use memory, if it's completely dark, to avoid the furniture. So what I'm doing is imagining, okay, there's a chair here, there's a table there, because I don't want to bump into them. But I'm imagining what is actually there, but I can't see it. And that is what we're doing in the generation stage. So the basic outlook is you are much more like a deity than you are like the person you have always thought you were. Okay, And now it's time to get into the details. I'm going to break it down into 5 parts. This is a Nyingma Mahayoga a breakdown, but it's the one that we use here, that Lama Tratup used in his elaborate presentation of the generation stage using the stages of the path. And it's practical because it will correspond most closely to the practices we do here as a community. The 5 stages, and of course there are really 6 of them, or it wouldn't be Tibetan Buddhism as we know it. Well, we may not, are the 3 samadhis. Those are the first 3. Single mudra, that's number 4. Elaborate mudra, that's really number 4. And cluster assembly sadhana, that's number 5. So each of these stages corresponds to a part of our life. And there are lots of bits and pieces that make them up in between. So the first of the 3 samadhis is the samadhi of that. Deshinyi, just that, just like that. And we often translate it suchness and so on, which is kind of a cop-out, because the whole point of the term is you can't describe it. So you're just saying that, that. And so it's the samadhi of resting to the best as we can in the ground, in the nature of mind, the Dharmakaya, the Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it, that. And we might as well just say that, because all these other terms are pretentious, aren't they? Well, it's nice to say Buddha nature because it's uplifting. But finally, in the Vajrayana, you just call it that. And we also refer to Buddhas as the ones who've gone to that. They're like that. They went that way. One of those. Okay. So, as beginners, we do this largely in an imaginary way. We either use reason to contemplate emptiness or some other device. But the purpose of this, obviously, and the correspondence is fourfold. In the context of the ground, it corresponds to the ground's nature, which is referred to in this context as primordial purity, or purity from the start. In the context of what is to be purified, it purifies the delusion about and of, so it's kind of like we could say the hangover delusion of when our trouble most recently started. And it most recently started with our previous death. In terms of what purifies, which means it corresponds to an aspect of the completion stage, it corresponds to the experience of luminosity, or the clear light, which we'll get to tomorrow. And we'll get to talking about it. And in terms of the fruition, the samadhi of that corresponds to the achievement of the Dharmakaya, the moment of Buddhahood. The second samadhi is called the samadhi of ubiquitous appearance, but it really doesn't refer so much to appearance as to compassion. The second samadhi consists of, for an advanced practitioner spontaneously, and for most of us through an effort of thought or reminding ourselves, the recognition that it is only because we do not recognize that we suffer. That suffering is unnecessary. It's all based on a mistake. A very, very old mistake. But it's all based on a mistake. So that's the only reason why we all suffer. And when you realize that, then, as the third Karmapa writes in his aspiration of Mudra, the affect of the realization of emptiness arises as compassion. Now, this is among the three types of compassion what is called compassion focused upon dharmas, if you refer to Lord Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation. The compassion focused on sentient beings is what we normally think of as compassion. But at a certain point, when you see the absolute non-necessity of any of this happening, that inspires a greater level of compassion. So it is still compassion for beings, but the reference is that it's unnecessary. So that is the second samadhi, the samadhi of ubiquitous appearance or radiance, but it really means the radiance or appearance of compassion. And if in what's called ngedzotlam, or the certain complete path, then each of these samadhis is practiced individually until one gains stability in it. What we do is called mugam, or it's like imagining that you're meditating. It's kind of like pretend, rushing through it and so on. Now, in terms of in the context of the ground, this second samadhi corresponds to the character of the ground. The nature of the ground is primordial purity, but the character of the ground is spontaneous presence. And the difference between these two is that primordial purity is the absence of anything that could ever be inherently impure. But spontaneous presence is the presence of that which is not impure. So we have a tendency as American Buddhists, because of the history of certain schools of thought predominating in American Buddhist scholarship until recently, of thinking of the ground as nothingness, as a negative. It is neither something nor nothing. To think of it as nothingness is to disparage Samattabhadra, and thereby all Buddhas, including your teacher. To think of it as something is just wrong. But you're better off thinking of it as something than nothing. As Lord Gampopa remarks, quoting Nagarjuna, said, people who fixate on something or at least may have a higher rebirth, but people who fixate on nothing become completely nihilistic. So that's what it corresponds to in the ground. In the context of what is to be purified, the second samadhi corresponds to our awakening in the Bardo. By awakening, I don't mean Buddhahood, I mean the return of consciousness. And the beginning of the conscious experience of the Bardo. But that does not mean that you know you're dead. As someone once said, what do people do after they die? They get up and go to work. For a while. Anyway. In terms of what purifies, this corresponds to the development of the illusory body in the completion stage. And in terms of the fruition, it's when the Buddha, having achieved the Dharmakaya, from it or within it, arises as the Sambhogakaya. The third samadhi is the samadhi of cause. And cause here refers to something. Now, in a Mahayoga practice per se, the cause will usually be the seed syllable of the deity. So in the case of our Guru Rinpoche practice, it is a Shri. In the case of Vajrayogini, Vam. In the case of Yamantaka, Hum. But there are exceptions to this. Sometimes, instead of the seed syllable, the scepter of the deity, marked by that seed syllable, will arise, as in the case of our Vajrakumara or Vajrakila practice. Sometimes the seed syllable will arise and turn into the scepter, as happens with the Guru Rinpoche practice. And sometimes the seed syllable will turn into the deity or into the entire mandala, as happens with the Yamantaka practice and in a different way with the Vajrayogini practice. In any case, and sometimes the samadhi of cause is actually the form of the deity itself, as happens with some practices, but nothing that you've done here yet. But basically, the samadhi of cause is resting your mind on the seed syllable of the deity. And in the most definitive form of training in the generation stage, you would do that until you get a clear appearance. Clear appearance in this case is defined as having 8 attributes, but basically it can be summarized as 2 or 3. One is that when you imagine the seed syllable in front of you, it actually obstructs vision. So in other words, if I imagined the seed syllable between me and Davis, I wouldn't be able to see Davis's face. I don't have that ability. Just so I'm not, the management does not make any claims here. Well, I'm not management. He's management. The other thing is you can change its size and color. You can visualize it anywhere. You can visualize it in your heart. You can visualize it on top of your head. You can visualize it moving. You can do all sorts of things. Now, the samadhi of cause corresponds in the ground to the fact that the ground is awareness. That is both primordial purity and spontaneous presence. Usually what they'll say is the nature is primordial purity. The character is spontaneous presence. And the goodness of it is awareness, which is their unity. Now, we can't experience the ground completely, but on a very basic level, what we can say is, if you have a mind, that's what it is. That's all it is. Okay. In terms of what is to be purified, the samadhi of cause corresponds to the fully blown arising of the mental body in the bardo. At this point, you still might not know you're dead. In terms of what purifies, it corresponds to, in the completion stage, the achievement of unity requiring training, so a learner's unity. Yeah, lope zongjuk. It's like we say learner's permit or when you're learning to drive. Yeah, learner's unity. It's kind of like the learner's permit of Buddhahood. And in terms of the fruition, it corresponds to when within the Sambhogakaya, the Buddha then displays Nirmanakaya. If you look at great expositions of the way the universe works, such as Longchenpa's, which one is it? Well, there's several that describe this, but Yijinzu, maybe it's Yijinzu. I think the wish-fulfilling treasury, he describes this. You know, we think the Sambhogakaya is up there or out there or, you know, and some of them are, but apparently we are inhabiting the universe that we know is the equivalent of a tiny particle of light somewhere within the body of the Buddha Vairochana, probably on a lotus that's 13 of 20, on the 13th level of 25. He's kind of got like, you remember CDs? You remember those things we had for CDs? Yeah, he's got one of those, but it's lotuses anyway, and we're one of the CDs. Whether that's literal or figurative or neither or both or something else, I don't know. It's beyond me. It's way above my pay grade. Okay. So within the Sambhogakaya, that Buddha arises as Nirmanakaya. So the idea is that by practicing these three samadhis, you purify these parts of your history. You prepare yourself to practice the corresponding completion stage practices, illusory body, clear light, and learner's unity, or unification, and you rehearse your future Buddhahood. Now, the fourth stage is not a separate samadhi, and it's called single mudra. Technically, single mudra includes the samadhi of cause. So you divide the practice of what we could call the samadhi of cause or single mudra into two, subtle and gross. The subtle is just the seed syllable, and gross is when from the seed syllable the body of the deity arises. And then you generate the same degrees of clarity and pliancy of mind that you developed with the seed syllable. Now, traditionally, there are separate sadhanas or liturgies for doing this. So there will be forms of most deities that are called single mudra. It doesn't mean that if a deity has a consort, they don't. They do, if they're going to, but single mudra means single form, deity body in this case. not consort. So, and as Lama Trata pointed out, we don't do a lot of these in this tradition because the Barway Dorje tradition seems to be principally designed for those who can sort of skip stages. But there are a couple of them. For example, the peaceful Manjushri section at the beginning of Yamantaka is a single deity, only one deity. And the first part of the subtle essence Vajrasattva, where it's just Mr. and Mrs. Vajrasattva in a palace, in a sphere of light, without the peaceful and wrathful deities and so on. That principally is a single mudra. We see this also in the Sarma tradition. For example, there are, in that case, it's called single ornament. Single ornament practices of Guhya Samaja, Hevajra, Chakra Sambhara, Mahamaya, all of the tantras that come from Lord Marpa. And those are found in the Kajung Aksu. In some cases, those are used as daily practices when someone has done the more elaborate practice in retreat. But originally, it seems they were intended as, first you develop a clear vision of one deity, and then you introduce the entourage. So a single mudra doesn't have a separate level of correspondences because it's part of the samadhi of cause. The fourth level is elaborate mudra. And that's simply when you visualize the entire mandala of the deity. So for example, it would be, if you were doing Guru Rinpoche practice, there are single mudra sadhanas, like the embodiment of the three jewels, but then you would practice something like the assembly of Vidyadharas of the Nyingtik tradition, or the combined sadhana of the Vidyadhara gurus of our tradition, or the dispelling all obstacles of the Chokje Lingpa tradition, and so on. And these are all forms of Guru Rinpoche that have an entourage. In our case, externally, the 8 names and 4 who embody discipline, and then the 5 internal mandalas in the body mandala. And that's called elaborate mudra because it's elaborate. There's a lot of deities. And this corresponds actually in the ground. It corresponds to the potentially infinite variety of Nirmanakaya's activity. In the context of what is to be purified, single mudra corresponds to birth. When you pass through the bardo in a mental body, you've actually entered the womb and been born. And elaborate mudra corresponds to adolescence. Things are getting complicated. But there are other bits and pieces that go in between these. For example, in many cases, there will be detailed symbolism in the process of the syllable turning into the deity, detailed symbolism regarding the place of birth and the manner of conception and birth. So, for example, the seed syllable may emit other syllables that turn into the elements, and then on top of that, another seed syllable that will turn into a palace, and then within the palace, you could have all sorts of other things, but basic minimum, you'll definitely have a lotus flower with either a sun or a moon or both. And those, if there's nothing else, the moon represents your father's sperm, the sun, your mother's ovum, and the lotus, your mother's uterus and womb. Often, however, it's more complicated than that. Not so much in the stuff we do here, but sometimes the seed syllable will appear in the midst of another sun and moon. And in that case, the other sun and moon represent and they come from the vowels and consonants of the Sanskrit alphabet, and then they all mix together and so on. And then the seed syllable becomes the scepter, which in that case represents the zygote fetus and so on. And then when the scepter becomes the deity, that is birth. Those things correspond very closely to other things, not just to birth. So, for example, the generation of the mandala from the seed syllable is when the Buddha chooses the site of their awakening. The transformation of the seed syllable into the scepter represents their achievement of the first bodhisattva level. So in some sadhanas, especially in the Sarma tradition, like the Karma Kaju Chakra Samvara sadhana, there will be radiation, emission and withdrawal of light rays, which represents gathering the two accumulations for one period of innumerable kalpas in order to achieve the first bodhisattva level. And then it'll happen again from the scepter and the seed syllable, and then reabsorbed, which represents the bodhisattvas gathering their two accumulations for two more innumerable periods of kalpas, and then transforming into the perfect Buddha. There is, and this is a tricky point, but is very, very important to understand, and it's most clearly explained from the things that I've studied in the Hevajra Tantra, which is actually called the two examinations or two treatments. It's two dialogues between the Buddha and two of his disciples. One is a bodhisattva of Vajragarbha, and the other is his consort as Hevajra's Naratmya. And in the questions and answers, when they're talking about the generation stage, the Buddha points out that whether you think of it as Buddha Shakyamuni or Hevajra or Buddha Shakyamuni looking like Hevajra, it's all the Buddha. The Buddha points out that the details of our messed up lives are distortions of pure reality. And this is a point that often gets swept under the rug because it's a little subtle. The Buddha says, why do we gestate for slightly under 10 months? They have to make it 10. I know that it's more like 9, but the symbolism doesn't work unless you say 10. You'll see. Why do we have a placenta? What is the true relationship of a newborn to their mother? So these things are not impure. They are, in our impure perception, distortions of true reality. He said, conception is a bodhisattva's awakening. The 10 months, that's why it has to be 10, are the 10 bodhisattva stages. Birth is the achievement of Buddhahood. The site of awakening is your mother's womb and the birth canal. Also, birth, he says, is self-arisen monastic vows. He says, your abbot, your preceptor, is your mother. Your dharma robes are the placenta. And so he talks about all these things. Now, we should not go too far with this and think that therefore we don't need the path. But the point is, our distorted reality is a distortion of pure reality. Why do we have 5 senses? Why do we have 5 fingers? Why do we, why all these 5s? Well, Vajrayana says there's a reason. Okay, but that's not our topic right now. We can ask about that later. So elaborate mudra corresponds to adolescence, and usually if it's part of the basic practice you're doing, as with our Guru Rinpoche practice and so on, then there will be lots of bits and pieces. A single mudra sadhana can be very, very stripped down, but an elaborate mudra sadhana will also have offerings and praises and things like that. The offerings, making of offerings, purifies your relationship with the world of your senses. And the offering of praises to the deity is to purify your all the negativity of your sense of self. Those we don't need specifically. I haven't seen specific correlations of those with the other three, but just with what they purify. And then we come to the final level of practice, which is called cluster assembly sadhana. This is something that we haven't done here yet. I'm translating there are, in the Barway Dorje tradition, first of all, cluster assembly sadhana only exists in the Nyingma tradition. The Sarma traditions don't have it. Although what Marpa did was kind of a cluster assembly version of elaborate ornament. And I'll explain what that was. And certainly what Indrabhuti did, but Indrabhuti was in India. They didn't have Sarma and Nyingma then, things hadn't. In the Barway Dorje tradition, we have two of these, which means there are four. There's the long one. What is it called? Hold on, I have to look at my thingies. Template for the accomplishment framework. But what's its long name? The accomplishment framework for all yidams of the Assembly of Great Splendor arranged in sequence. Okay. That's Terma of Barway Dorje. So there's one that can be used with any of the practices. So how do I get four? Well, there's a shorter one that Barway Dorje edited down from that. And then I asked Lama Tratop, of course, so there's two. He said, no, there's really, because the Vajrayogini has its own one, and Yamantaka has its own one. So I said, does each one really have its own one? He said, no, there's really only two, except for the Vajrayogini and the Yamantaka, and those are different. I say, they're basically the same as the long one, right? So yeah, they're pretty much the same. So there's basically two, but they're four. Now, the reason that I know this kind of stuff and joke about it is because this is my life right now. I spend my time, my day job is translating this stuff. So you have to find out what is repeated and what isn't. And you think that it's all the same, and then all of a sudden, This most recently happened when Lama Tratop told me to translate something for the summer, which he did a few months ago, and I did it. And he said, there's a short one, a long one. You've already done the short one for Subtle Essence Vajrasattva. Why don't you do the long one? And I said, okay, I'll do the long one. I have to translate everything anyway. So I translated the long one. And then he gave me the text of the things put in order, and it wasn't the same thing at all. And I said, this isn't what you asked me to translate. He said, oh, yeah, I meant the other long one. So there's actually a short one, an intermediate one, and a long one. And the long one has everything that's in the intermediate one except some stuff. And the intermediate one has some of what's in the long one, but not most stuff. And the short one has some of each, but not all of it. So I hope that's clear. So that's my life, and I'm sorry to burden you with it. Well, I'm going to tell you what cluster assembly sadhana is. That what I call it? Is okay. So assembly just means a group of people practicing, and sadhana means sadhana. The mandala may or may not be different from the elaborate Mudra form. There are super elaborate mandalas. I'll give you two examples, one from the Sarma tradition, one from the Nyingma tradition. What Lord Marpa practiced was the 9 deity mandala of Hevajra, which actually, of course, has 10, because there's Mrs. Hevajra, but the couples are counted as one because they like the number 9, except that they correspond to the 10 strings. Anyway. So he turned his household into that mandala. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. So you could say that he was doing cluster assembly sadhana even with the 9 deity form. But there is a super elaborate Hevajra mandala that's called the Hevajras of the 5 families, where there's about 45. 9 times 5 is 45 plus 4, so 49 deity mandala. And that's practiced and upheld by all traditions, but principally by the Sakya and the Karma Kagyu. And so there's always a more elaborate version. In Guru Rinpoche's practice was the Nyingma equivalent of Hevajra, who is called Vajrahiruka, or in Tibetan Yangdak. And his personal form that he practiced was like Marpa, was 9 deity mandala. And it's the same mandala. They look different. They look really different, but the Dakinis have the same names. And but when it's done as a cluster assembly practice, it's all 58. So that is the source of the mandala of the wrathful deities. Now, what distinguishes cluster assembly practice is not so much just the mandala, whether it's a more complicated version like 58 or 49 instead of 9. You know, or in Chakrasamvara, it could be 62 instead of 13 or 5, and so on. In the subtle essence Vajrasattva, we have just the single mudra form and then the elaborate mudra where you've got all the peaceful and wrathful deities, plus the Vidyadharas, plus the Viras and Dakinis, plus the Dharmapalas. That's hinted at, but it isn't spelled out. But it's how the practice is done. And there are 2 differences. First thing is it's 24/7. From the beginning of the first session, the mantra must not cease. So in monasteries, you'll have extremely tired little monks at the back of the room chanting the mantra in shifts all day and night. And in terms of the sessions, there are 6 or 8 sessions a day. And usually 3 during the day and 3 during the night. And you, everyone, I don't know how they do it at Raktrul Monastery, but what I've seen, everyone does 4 sessions, and then you take turns. Everyone does the first 3, and then you're on 3 shifts at night. So you get a little bit of sleep. I think, based on Lama Tratop's remarks, that their way of doing it, nobody sleeps, nobody leaves, it's like, well, we'll see. So one difference is it's much more elaborate. The shrine is more elaborate. There have to be hundreds of every offering, 100 tormas, 100 amritas, 100 raktas, 100 bowls of flowers, 100 sticks of incense, 100, everything's 100 feasts. The feasts are offered 6 times a day, and it begins with the creation of a boundary, the subjugation of Rudra. But the other thing that's different about it, and this is the key difference, is that each person portrays one of the deities. So if you were going to do they do it commonly in our tradition with Yamantaka, Vajrakila, and Vajrayogini, but also with Guru Rinpoche and then the other ones. You would have to have a number of practitioners equal to or exceeding the number of deities in the mandala. So you can double up. I mean, you can have 2 people, I would assume, doing the same deity. But so there's an actual liturgy where, up to that point, everybody, you visualize yourself as the principal deity surrounded by the mandala. Then that changes. You all become one of the deities. And you're assigned a specific role, a specific deity and specific roles. And every single thing you use is consecrated. The cooking materials, the cooking vessels, the medicine that's there in case anybody gets sick, the the drums, and everybody gets names, Vajra this, Vajra that, Karma this, Karma that. It's quite intense. So the idea is to do what Indrabhuti did. When the Buddha taught King Indrabhuti the Guhyasamaja Tantra, the Buddha transformed Indrabhuti's entire court into the mandala of Guhyasamaja. And in that state, they rose to the celestial realm all at once. And that's the idea, to achieve awakening as one cluster in one mandala. And because of its being so elaborate and so intense, it is considered the greatest way to achieve awakening through the generation stage. Now, it will involve, if you read the small print, you'll see that it will involve some completion stage practice as well. It can't be done without it. But strictly speaking, it is a part of the generation stage. And I don't want to go into more detail about cluster assembly sadhana simply because we're not going to do it here in the next year or two. So eventually we will, I'm sure. But, and I don't want to spoil the surprises. Okay. Now we have, so we've gone through the 5 parts of the generation stage, and basically most of the correspondences occur through the 3 samadhis and the development of the mandala, the makings of offerings and praises and so on. I wanted, of course, at some point during this, there is mantra recited, 1 or more mantras. And I'm going to leave mantra till later because it's something about it is kind of a in-between. I want to deal with it as a segue between generation and completion for various reasons, so you'll see. At the culmination of any generation stage practice, at least 2 things will happen. The visualization of the mandala will dissolve, either inward or all at once. And in terms of the ground, that corresponds to the fact that despite of all of its activity, the Nirmanakaya is not a solid thing. So while active, it is yet beyond being something. And then we'll do the 2 parts together, and then you re-arise as the deity, either as the complete mandala or as the principal deity with the 3 syllables in the 3 places. Now, if we're talking about an elaborate practice, like elaborate mudra, that will be preceded by further offerings and praises and so on before you end. And if we're talking about something like cluster assembly sadhana, of course there will be taking of siddhi with all sorts of things involved in that. But in terms of the basic symbolism, the generation stage concludes with what's called the withdrawal and re-arising of the deity or mandala. And people, I say that people often confuse this with the completion stage, and that often in the sort of public presentation of Vajrayana, we tell people that's the completion stage, and that's because we don't want to tell them what the real completion stage is. Sorry. It does correspond to an aspect of the completion stage. Just as in the ground, it corresponds to the fact that the appearances are still appearances of primordial purity, and primordial purity is still spontaneous presence represented by the re-arising. In terms of what is to be purified, it corresponds to your upcoming we might say, impending death and re-arising in the Bardo. So it's a rehearsal for dying consciously. If you get in the habit of whenever you find yourself emerging from a state of unconsciousness, like when you wake up in the morning or during the night, of every time you do that, re-arising as the deity with your your three places marked with the three syllables, then that habit will assert itself in the Bardo. And if it does, you will achieve liberation. An even easier and more effective thing to do is, and this is a very good thing, is every time you awake from unconsciousness or every time you're scared, pray to your guru. As Bardor Rinpoche mentioned one weekend when he was teaching here, he said that if you simply collapse all of this into the guru, then you don't have to remember all the details. And he said if you simply train yourself through habit to pray to your guru whenever you're scared or whenever you suddenly wake up, those two techniques, and it's one technique, but will help you tremendously in the Bardo, because two things are going to happen in the Bardo. At some point, we're going to become conscious after having been unconscious. And we probably won't know we're dead. And the other thing is, at some point, we're going to be very scared. And so it's good preparation, like fire drill, to do these, People prepare for death with elaborate means, such as the ejection of consciousness and all these things. And those things are wonderful. But the most important preparation you can do, beyond any generation or completion, is to learn to think with devotion of your guru and pray to him or her at critical moments and when awaking from unconsciousness. In the array of Ati Tantra, Dzogchen Tantra, it says, better than meditating on the generation stage for a kalpa is a single moment's thought of the guru. Better than meditating on the completion stage for a kalpa is one moment of mixing your mind with that of your guru. Anyway, just a thought. So, in terms of preparation for the completion stage, the dissolution or withdrawal corresponds to the achievement of the ultimate clear light. And the re-arising corresponds to re-arising in the non-learner's body of unity, which is the actual Sambhogakaya. And tomorrow when we go through the completion stage, you'll see what all that is. Now, the post-meditation conduct of the generation stage. Conduct here and the samaya of the generation stage are pretty much the same thing. And I'll give you 3 ways to look at it. The first way is how, and this includes the samaya not just of the generation stage, but also the completion stage. And this comes from the writings of the great Siddha Karma Chame. And he wrote, if you see your root guru and your yidam as indivisible, and you never give rise to antipathy toward them or him or it, whatever you call it, that includes all samaya. So that's an easy way because it means there's just one. Another way to explain it which sounds different but comes down to the same thing, we find in our own, here in the, a part of our Vajrayogini, the White Kachari sadhana. Recollect the purity of your three gates and help beings. So you can include it all in two. To constantly remember that your body and all appearances are divine, the deity, that your speech and all sounds are mantra, and that your mind and everybody else's is Dharmakaya, Buddha nature. That's one thing. And the other thing is, use that pure perception, pure outlook to help others, which doesn't mean you go around preaching it, but you know, if you see everyone that way, you'll be nicer, you'll be better, you'll be more helpful, and so on. So that's another way of putting it. And then the third way involves 28 different, 3 root and 25 branch samayas of conduct. Sometimes they're classified as view, meditation, conduct, but basically in our system we classify them all as governing conduct. Lama Trotop went through those when he taught the stages of the path, and I suppose I could go through them. Do you want me to go through them? I mean, we have time, or do you want to move on to something else? I hate rules and regulations. All right, we'll do them. So these are the main. I'll go through them but quickly because I don't want to turn this into a lecture on rules and regulations. These I do have to look up. The root, and now it's important to understand, samaya of course means contract, but it's a contract like the contract you have with your pharmacist and physician on how to take the medicine. You know, and the assumption is that you will take the medicine every day and that you'll take it at the right times and abstain from whatever, you know, like grapefruit juice or whatever it is they won't let you have that you really wish you could have. I like grapefruit juice, I can't have it. I just sneered at the doctor. I know it's not your fault. It's all of you. So it's like that. It's really for your own good. But also the thing is to understand that conduct or behavior, meditation, view, and the contract, samaya, are all really one thing. It all kind of fits together. So the root samaya of body, speech, and mind can be presented in 2 ways that are very different, but that actually come down to the same thing. The one way is to say that the samaya of body is to be loving and appreciative of your guru and your Vajra brothers and sisters. The other way is to say it is to see your body and the bodies of all other beings as pure. Now those sound like 2 very different instructions, but if you think about it, because when you say Vajra brothers and sisters, they say there are levels of family proximity, and the farthest level includes all beings. So those who entered the same mandala under the supervision or empowerment by the same guru are called full brothers and sisters. Those who have the same guru but entered a different mandala or entered the same mandala with a different guru are called half brothers and sisters. And then, it goes like people who've generated bodhichitta are close brothers and sisters. People who've simply taken refuge are distant brothers and sisters, and all beings are very distant. But they're all your brothers and sisters. Again, the speech one way of explaining it is to never let the continuity of mantra and mudra be broken. Mudra here means imagining yourself as the deity. So whatever deity it is that you have chosen to practice, you do that constantly. And the mantra is, either constantly in mind or you set aside a time to say it every day and so on. And then there are levels of that because you have different deities with different levels of reliance upon them and so on. The other way of putting it is simply to see all speech, including your own, and all sound as the sound of the mantra. And then again with the samayas of mind, the one is to not betray that which is entrusted to you in confidence or as a secret. And the other one is to view your thoughts and the thoughts of others as the display of wisdom. So those are the main ones. And then the branch ones are 5 fives. And they're all connected with, and this is the only reason I'm going through this, that notion of why 5 of this, why 5 of that. Is it totally random? Sometimes I think it might be, because our species, we have these 5 senses, but other species have different senses, and that's only on this planet. There must be, I cannot imagine what things look like. We happen to have 5 fingers and 5 toes, most of us, but it's like, does that really? But anyway, well, let's see what it says. Maybe if they teach this on a planet where people have 6 fingers, 6 toes, and 6 senses, they're good at that. They can adjust it. They'll just add the overriding family of Vajradhara to the other families, and then we're all set up. Okay, so the first are the 5 samayas not to be rejected. And these are your 5 kleshas. Not rejected means that if you try to suppress them, you're copping out. They will bounce back. They will come back. Because the act of suppression itself creates conflict, and kleshas love conflict. So the samaya is to learn to see their nature. You're allowed to suppress them temporarily. Like if you're feeling like you're getting angry at somebody and you don't want to do it, you're allowed not to get angry at the person. But you have to also work on seeing through anger. And then the 5 things to be accepted are the 5 ingredients in this, the amrita, that stuff. It's actually mostly vegetable material. In fact, I doubt you'd find any, if you did an analysis of that stuff, I doubt you'd find. But symbolically, we call it the 5 nectars or 5 amritas. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily just come from human and animals. So like one of them is blood, but we also consider, for example, any tree that has anything red can be called blood, or rakta, because rakta just means red, and so on. So, but the real meaning of this is not to reject, not to judge the things we normally think of as impure, like urine and excrement and so on. It does not mean you have to drink pee or anything. Don't worry about that. I've seen people get really confused by that, and I've heard of instances of that. Then there's the 5 to be done, Five to be practiced, the five samayas to be practiced are first, liberation. And they put it in a funny way so that it sounds like it means killing, but it doesn't. It means you must take the life of ignorance by bringing your prana into the central channel. And the pun here is that prana is the word life. So, so the first is to try to bring that which is a completion stage practice. Then the second one is, to take that which is not given. To take that which is not given means to engage in the practices of the third empowerment without losing bodhichitta. This is a funny one. To unite with the other woman. The other woman refers to prajna paramita. This one sounds like it refers to sex, but it doesn't. It means you must learn to unify your mind, the cognition that contemplates emptiness, with emptiness itself. So that's lying. To tell the untruth of samsara and nirvana. In other words, you have to speak in a way that is appropriate to the dispositions and needs of others. So that although ultimately there is no such thing as samsara and nirvana, and you have to have that view, you must recognize that we experience things that way, and you have to talk in a realistic way. So basically these are killing, stealing, screwing, lying, and then there's harsh words. To protect beings by reciting forceful mantra and protect beings from obstacles. So that's the harsh words, is the fifth one. So they don't mean that you should do bad things, but they put it that way because that way you'll remember them. So if I say to you, try to draw all your winds into the central channel, practice without losing bodhicitta, unite your mind with prajna paramita, speak appropriately in accordance with beings' actual experience, and protect beings through forceful mantra, that's a lot to remember. But if I simply say killing, stealing, screwing, lying, and harsh words, you'll remember, right? Okay, good. And then, so those are the five to be done. And then the five samayas to be known. This is simple. It's basically that everything corresponds to one of the five Buddha families. The five aggregates are the five male Buddhas, the five elements, the five female Buddhas, the senses and their objects, the male and female bodhisattvas, the five colors, the five types of herbal medicine, the five flavors. They're usually six, but here they cut it down to five because they want it to be five. You know, the five senses, the five of this, the five of that. You know, it all corresponds to. And if you take this to heart, I mean, you can get a little bit nuts. I got a little bit nuts in retreat when I started thinking about sports team uniforms. And so Michael, beware of this with hockey. You do start to think, oh my God, there's a reason. They have an affiliation with this and this. You know. So I don't know. So don't go nuts. And then the five samayas to be accomplished or to achieve are simply that everything that appears or exists, external or internal, environment or inhabitants, has always been in nature the five Buddhas. So in other words, that's what you're trying to achieve. Now the purpose of these 25 branch things is to support the three main ones. And obviously the point is the sacredness, not to reject anything because you think of it as unworthy, as not to make any exceptions. So that there's no, just like with bodhicitta, And that's why I said that the generation stage is very much an extension of that. There is no being who does not have Buddha nature. Therefore, there is no being that we should not see as Buddha. There is no external phenomenon that is not the display of our own mind. And our own mind is not just the Dharmakaya, but also the Sambhogakaya. So therefore, as a great master once said, Vajrayogini is not red because roses are red. Roses are red because Vajrayogini is red. That's very important. Okay, now back to our main topic, the fruition of the generation stage. You have heard, those of you who've attended Lama Tratop's teachings on the generation stage, and you've all read and recited in the 10th day feast aspiration prayer of something called the 4 Vidyadharas, or 4 Vidyadhara stages. Although they're all associated with Mahayoga, technically speaking, it's really the first that is the fruition of the generation stage. But it can lead to the third. And I'll explain how that works. The first Vidyadhara, first of all, a Vidyadhara in India originally meant a wizard, like Harry Potter style wizard. But, and so the vidya that they dared or held was magical knowledge, magical skills. But we use it to mean holder, we use vidya, which in Tibetan is rikpa, to mean the nature of mind. And so a vidyadhara we understand as someone who has partially or wholly realized the nature of mind. Sometimes it's glossed as Rignak Zimba, a holder of the awareness mantra, someone who's gained a power through mantra and so on. But anyway, so the first level of a Vidyadhara is what's called fully ripened Vidyadhara. Now, to understand what fully ripened means, we have to go back to basic Buddhism, which is usually a good idea anyway. Every action, every volitional action has 3 results, of which there are 4. The fully ripened result, the environmental result, and the dominant result. Now, the fully ripened result means that every volitional action, and this is an unpleasant thing that I'm going to tell you, everything we do consciously will cause an entire future rebirth. So, for example, and fully ripened refers to a fully ripened set of the 5 aggregates. So it means, for example, if I kill a mosquito, I will, at some future point, unless that action is expunged from my all basis consciousness, I will, at some point in the future, sooner or later, undergo a probably many lifetimes where I experience however I killed the mosquito. So if I swatted it, being smashed out of the air, if I crushed it, being crushed by something, and so on. If I give a penny to a homeless person, I will at some point in the future experience probably many lifetimes of incredible wealth, unimaginable wealth. And those are the primary or most dramatic results of actions, the fully ripened result. So we should never think that even the smallest wrongdoing is insufficient to cause an extremely horrendous rebirth. Sorry to be all fire and brimstone-y, but the other results, the dominant result, are that you will tend to want to do the thing. There's a habit. And also, and the other part of that, which is why there are 4 of the 3, is that it will tend to happen to you even if you're born as a human being. So, and then the environmental result is each and every good and bad action will cause you to be reborn in a certain type of environment. And you can look those up there. So, fully ripened here refers to our 5 aggregates in this life. They are the product of karmic ripening, the full ripening of a karmic action. So fully ripened Vidyadhara is a Vidyadhara who is not yet able to transform their physical body into a deity body. But nevertheless has achieved through the generation stage the ability to transform their mind into the body of the deity. Which means that a fully ripened Vidyadhara will always see themselves as the deity. And in most cases, others will see them as the deity. Typically, non-humans will see them as the deity, but humans, depending upon their karmic affiliation, will see something that's not run-of-the-mill. So when that person dies, although they have no control over their lifespan and have not transformed themselves physically into the deity, when they die, their mind will immediately actually arise in the form of the deity. So, although technically speaking, the generation stage alone cannot bring anything except the first level, in fact, they will, by achieving the first level in this life, achieve the 3rd level immediately after death. So, that is somebody who can actually, who never wavers from seeing themselves as the deity, presumably in dreams and so on. So we're going to stop here. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about mantra and pranayama and vajra repetition, and then we'll have time for questions. Let's just use the short dedication this morning. We'll do the long one at the end of the afternoon. So it's on page 7. Sunam di tamje zigba nye tobne nyebe ranam pamjene che ga nachi balak trukbai sibe tsole drowa. Thank you and bon appetit.